I was adjusting the calibration on the control panel, trying to focus on the task at hand. The hum of the space station echoed around me, a constant reminder that we were isolated, cut off from everything else. The station was a marvel of human engineering, massive, sleek, filled with the promise of scientific discovery and technological advancements, but it often felt like a prison. It wasn't that the work was difficult, it was the loneliness, the vast emptiness of space pressing against the walls. That isolation, combined with the dangers of the deep void, had its own way of wearing on you. I wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's how I felt most days. I had a partner back on Earth, someone I cared for deeply. But here, in the endless expanse of space, with no distractions but work and the occasional communication with Earth, I found myself questioning everything. My partner and I had been in a committed relationship for years, and everything seemed fine until I was stationed here. I didn't expect things to change. I didn't want them to change. But they did. The captain of the station, though, was different. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin that shimmered faintly under the artificial lights, he was the embodiment of power and grace. His alien nature stood out in the room, not just because of his physical appearance, but because of the way he carried himself. He was distant, authoritative, yet there was an undeniable allure to him, a force of nature that made everyone around him defer, sometimes without even realizing it. It wasn't just his physical appearance that drew attention, though. There was something about him, something far more complex. He was a high-ranking officer, and we had only interacted in passing. Always professional, always guarded. Still, the tension between us was palpable, a flickering energy that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried. But it wasn't just that. There was also the fact that his species went through a mating cycle, a biological phenomenon that affected everything in their lives. I had heard stories about it, whispers among the crew, but I had never really understood what it meant. What did it feel like for him? For someone like me, who had only ever experienced the human version of attraction and desire, the thought of another being with instincts that didn't align with mine felt strange. At times, it felt like there was an unspoken barrier, something beyond my comprehension that kept me at arm's length. But that was before I started noticing the changes in him. I had seen the signs in the past few weeks, more intense stares, moments where he seemed caught between something primal and controlled. His temper was more volatile. He seemed restless, agitated at times, with moments where his presence seemed almost overpowering, as though he couldn't quite control his emotions. I had no idea what was going on at first. It wasn't until a conversation with one of the crew members, someone who had been with the station longer than I had, that I learned the truth. The mating cycle wasn't just something that occurred for the aliens. It was a part of their physiology, something they couldn't escape. And it wasn't like a simple human desire that could be easily ignored or suppressed. It was far more intense, far more consuming. The revelation hit me harder than I expected. It explained the strange behavior, the sudden outbursts, the unpredictable mood swings. And it also explained why the captain, despite his usual composed demeanor, was struggling with his own instincts. But knowing all of this didn't make it any easier to deal with. I began to notice the subtle changes. The way he looked at me when we passed in the halls, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. The tension in the air whenever we shared a workspace. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was something more, something I couldn't place. There was a connection, something undeniable, pulling us together despite the circumstances. But the real problem was the timing. I was in a committed relationship, and I had a duty to be faithful, even if I couldn't help but notice the way my heart raced whenever the captain was near. The more I tried to push those feelings aside, the more intense they became. I had spent years with someone back on Earth, building a life together, yet here I was, torn between duty and desire. I hadn't planned on any of this. I didn't come to the station to fall into temptation or let my emotions run wild. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to ignore the pull between us. I had no idea what was happening to me, or to him, but there was something magnetic about the situation. The captain's presence had a way of filling the room, commanding attention without saying a word. It was as though he knew exactly what effect he had on everyone around him, and he wielded it with an almost effortless grace. I couldn't help but wonder, was he aware of the effect he had on me? And if he was, did it matter? Did he even care about such things? For all I knew, his mating cycle was something he had little control over. It was biological, primal. He didn't need to act on it, but it was there, always present, just beneath the surface. And then there were the whispers. The rumors that spread through the crew like wildfire. Some people said the captain had indulged in relationships with other species before, though never openly. Others spoke about how his kind had different ideas of loyalty, of fidelity. But none of it made sense. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that he might view relationships the same way a human would. What if this wasn't about love, but about something entirely different? Something instinctual, something I couldn't even begin to understand. I couldn't decide if that made it easier or harder to navigate my feelings. The captain had a life outside of his work, one that no one fully understood. And yet, here I was caught between my duty and something I couldn't control. Something that I hadn't been prepared for. Something that made every moment we shared feel charged with a silent tension. As the days passed, I could feel myself slipping further into this strange, new reality. I wasn't sure where it would lead, or if I could even stop it from happening. But I knew one thing for certain. My life, my relationship, and everything I thought I understood about loyalty and love were all about to be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The days blurred together, the sterile hum of the space station now a constant presence in my life. It had been weeks since I first sensed the change in the captain, and each passing day seemed to build on the last, intensifying the tension between us. His mood swings were becoming more noticeable, more extreme. One moment, he would be aloof and commanding, his usual self, and the next, he'd be agitated, unable to focus, his temper on a hair trigger. It was unlike anything I had seen before. I couldn't quite place what it was, but there was something different about him now. Something that felt almost dangerous, even though I knew it wasn't intentional. The truth of it hit me one night while working late. I was in the observation deck, alone, the cold, dark expanse of space stretching out before me. I had always found comfort in the vastness of space, but tonight, there was an unfamiliar weight in the air. I wasn't the only one working late that night, though. The captain appeared in the doorway, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the room. His presence filled the space instantly, just as it always did, but tonight it felt heavier, more intense. He didn't speak at first, but I could see the tension in his posture. He was restless, his usual composure nowhere to be found. I glanced at him, offering a brief nod, but he didn't acknowledge it. His eyes were dark, intense, fixated on something, nothing, really, just the farthest reaches of space. I turned back to my work, but the air between us crackled with an energy I couldn't ignore. Without warning, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "It's getting worse." I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Was he talking about the work or something else? I didn't know what to say, but I could feel the shift in his energy, the pull that had been there for weeks, now impossible to ignore. It was as if the invisible barrier between us had evaporated, leaving only raw, unfiltered tension in its wake. "I don't know how much longer I can control it," he continued, his words heavy with meaning, though I couldn't fully understand them. His gaze was now fixed on me, intense, as if he were searching for something in my eyes. The space station felt impossibly small, the distance between us closing in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't know what to say. I had heard whispers from the crew about the alien mating cycle, the powerful biological urges that controlled everything about his species during certain periods. I had dismissed it as an oddity of alien physiology, something I couldn't begin to understand. But standing there in that moment, I realized that what I had dismissed as a curiosity was far more than that. It wasn't just something that affected him, it was something that had begun to affect me as well. The captain took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. The air between us seemed to thicken with every passing second, the unspoken tension building. He stopped just short of standing directly in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough that I could hear the change in his breathing. I should have never let it go this far, he said quietly, almost to himself. But there's nothing I can do now. It was impossible to ignore the intensity in his words, or the pull I felt toward him, a force I couldn't explain, nor did I want to resist. His alien nature, his strength, his power, all of it drew me in. But there was also something vulnerable in his voice, something raw and unguarded. I couldn't help but wonder, was he struggling with this as much as I was? Or was I the only one caught in this trap? For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, unacknowledged desires. His eyes were dark, searching mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way he made me feel, like I was the only thing in the universe that mattered. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something real, something that wasn't just physical attraction. It was deeper than that. But I couldn't let myself go there, not yet. Not while I still had a partner on Earth, someone I had promised to be faithful to. I knew what was happening. I had seen it in his eyes, the signs of his mating cycle beginning to take over. He was struggling with the same pull, the same desire. It was part of him, part of his biology, and there was nothing either of us could do to stop it. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The guilt gnawed at me, pulling at my every thought, even as I found myself drawn to him more than ever. "I have to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned away from him, trying to create space between us, but the moment the words left my mouth, I knew it was too late. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and before I could react, he placed a hand on my arm. His touch was firm, but not forceful, just a silent plea for something I couldn't quite understand. "You don't have to leave," he said, his voice low, thick with emotion. "I'm not going to hurt you." It was the way he said it that sent a jolt through me. His voice wasn't cold or calculating, it was almost desperate, like he was trying to reassure me, but also trying to control something far more powerful. I didn't know what to do. The conflict inside me was tearing me apart. I wanted to pull away, but at the same time, I didn't want to leave. I was scared, yes, but there was also a part of me that felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical desire. It was something more, something I couldn't put into words. But I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer in control. Neither of us were. The captain's struggle was my struggle, and there was no escaping it. We were both caught in the pull of his mating cycle, two people torn between duty and desire. And for the first time, I wondered if I would ever be able to walk away from this, or if it was already too late. I woke up to the quiet hum of the space station, the familiar sound now somehow unsettling. The sheets beside me were cold, the absence of his presence a sharp reminder of the events that had unfolded the night before. The captain's side of the bed was already empty, and as much as I tried to ignore it, the guilt surged through me, overwhelming every thought. I couldn't shake the image of what had happened between us. The heat, the rawness, and the way everything had blurred together in a moment of uncontrollable desire. My mind kept replaying it, each detail etched into my memory like an indelible mark. I sat up, my head spinning with a mix of confusion and shame. I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. I had tried to keep my distance, to maintain some semblance of control, but the pull between us had been too strong. I hadn't even known what I was getting myself into. But now, I couldn't escape it. The choices I had made were irreversible, and there was no going back. I glanced at the clock. Time had passed more quickly than I realized, the day slipping away from me as I lay there, paralyzed by my own thoughts. The station was still as cold and impersonal as ever, but now it felt more like a prison than a place of work. My responsibilities and the crew's expectations were no longer enough to distract me. I had crossed a line, and everything I thought I knew about loyalty, commitment, and what I was capable of had been upended in the span of a few hours. I knew I had to face the consequences of my actions eventually, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared to confront the fact that I had betrayed everything I had promised. The captain had acted on instincts that I couldn't fully understand, driven by his species' mating cycle, but that didn't excuse what had happened between us. I had chosen to follow that instinct, to give in to something I couldn't control. And now, I was left with the aftermath. There were no answers, no easy solutions. I could try to bury it all, pretend it had never happened, but that would only make things worse. I would never be able to unsee what had transpired. The truth was undeniable, and the consequences were now inevitable. The captain's role in this wasn't any less significant, but I was the one who had chosen to act. I was the one who had let myself be pulled into his orbit, even knowing the risks. I couldn't avoid him forever. As much as I wanted to pretend the night hadn't happened, the reality was staring me in the face. The captain was still a constant presence on the station, his power and influence undeniable. I would see him again soon, likely even later that day, and the awkwardness between us would be impossible to hide. He would know, just as I knew. There would be no escaping the tension. The thought of facing him filled me with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. What would he say? What would he want from me now that the line had been crossed? There was no guarantee he even cared about what had happened. His actions were driven by something primal, something that didn't necessarily require emotional attachment. But for me, it was different. I had crossed a boundary, and now I wasn't sure where I stood. I stood up, my legs unsteady as if I hadn't slept at all. The weight of the situation was pressing down on me, and the uncertainty of it all left me feeling hollow. What was I supposed to do now? How could I continue working on this station, knowing what had transpired? How could I go back to my life, to the person I had left behind on Earth, when everything had changed so drastically? I couldn't focus. I tried to work, to bury myself in tasks, but nothing felt right. The work I had once done with ease now felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Every moment was tainted by the guilt, by the knowledge that I had been a willing participant in something that shouldn't have happened. I had betrayed someone I loved, someone who trusted me, and I couldn't take it back. The days that followed were a blur. I kept my distance from the captain, avoiding him at every turn. I couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't pretend everything was normal. The crew noticed the shift, of course. They sensed the tension between us, but no one asked questions. It was as if they knew the unspoken rule. Some things were better left untouched. But I couldn't leave it alone. I couldn't just forget it. Eventually, our paths crossed again. It was unavoidable. He stood in front of me, tall and imposing as always, but there was something different in his gaze. It was as if he knew I was avoiding him, knew that I was struggling with what had happened. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to break the silence, but no words came. The weight of it all hung between us, thick and suffocating. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it before. His words weren't what I expected, but they carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. "You don't have to feel guilty." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him how wrong it all was, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. I had already made my choice. I had already crossed that line. "I should have stopped," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "I didn't think. You weren't the only one caught up in it," he interrupted gently. His tone wasn't harsh or accusatory, just a simple statement of fact. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the only one struggling with the aftermath. He, too, had been affected by the intensity of his mating cycle, but that didn't excuse what had happened. We had both been complicit in the betrayal. It didn't change what I felt or what I had done, but it did offer a strange sense of validation. I wasn't entirely alone in this. I wasn't the only one burdened by what we had shared. For the first time since it had all happened, I allowed myself to breathe. There was no immediate solution, no quick way to erase the consequences, but at least now I understood that neither of us was untouched by this. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the moment, we were both stuck in the same place. The days felt heavier now, each one marked by the lingering tension between the captain and me. Despite what had happened, despite the raw intensity of the night we had shared, there was an undeniable distance that had grown between us. We had both crossed a line, and now neither of us knew how to return to the roles we once held. The captain had tried to reassure me, to tell me that I didn't need to feel guilty, but those words rang hollow. It was easy for him to say. His nature was controlled by instincts far beyond his control, something primal that dictated his actions during his mating cycle. But for me, it wasn't that simple. I wasn't a victim of biology. I had made the choice, and that choice had consequences. The guilt weighed on me constantly, creeping into every moment. I couldn't escape it, couldn't push it away. It followed me through the corridors of the station, clung to me during meetings, during routine check-ins. And every time I crossed paths with the captain, I was reminded of the boundary we had crossed, a boundary that had no easy resolution. He had kept his distance too, and I didn't blame him. Neither of us knew how to act around the other anymore. I tried to push through the days, focusing on work, distracting myself with anything that didn't involve thinking about the mess I had made. But nothing worked. It felt like I was walking through a fog, every task dull and uninspired. Every conversation felt strained, and every glance at the captain seemed to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. I knew what he was thinking, knew that he felt the shift between us just as acutely as I did. But neither of us had the courage to address it, to say the words that would bring some clarity to the situation. It was easier to pretend, to let the silence stretch between us, even though it was suffocating. Then there was the crew. They had noticed the change in us too, the palpable shift in the air whenever we were in the same room. The whispers had started, subtle at first, just quiet rumors passed between shifts. I could see the way their eyes lingered on us, the questions they didn't ask but made clear through their stares. I could feel the judgment even though no one spoke it aloud. It was in the way the crew's behavior subtly changed when I entered a room. I could no longer escape it. My actions had become a topic of discussion, and it wasn't something I could hide behind the pretense of professionalism anymore. But worse than the crew's quiet judgment was the constant ache of knowing that I had betrayed someone I had loved. I thought about my partner constantly, the person I had left behind on Earth, the one I had promised loyalty and devotion. What would they think if they knew? How could I face them knowing that I had given myself to someone else, someone who wasn't even human? The guilt twisted deeper as the days wore on, the weight of my actions dragging me down. I couldn't escape the thought of them, couldn't escape the looming knowledge that I had ruined something pure. And yet, even in the midst of the guilt, there was a strange pull between the captain and me. It wasn't just physical anymore. It had grown into something more complicated, something that I couldn't define. Every time our eyes met, there was a flicker of something unspoken, something neither of us was willing to acknowledge. It was as if we were both trapped in this space between desire and regret, unable to break free from the tension that had bound us together. I couldn't tell if the pull I felt toward him was genuine, or if it was just the lingering effects of the mating cycle. I couldn't tell if he felt the same way, or if he was simply waiting for it to pass, hoping that this too would fade like the cycle always did. But I wasn't sure if I wanted it to fade. The captain seemed to be going through his own turmoil. He had grown quieter in the days following that night, his usual confidence replaced by a distant, almost brooding demeanor. He would disappear into his quarters for long stretches, sometimes not coming out for hours. When he did emerge, his gaze was unfocused, his movements mechanical. I could see the way the cycle had drained him, leaving him hollow. It wasn't just the biological need anymore, it was something deeper. Something that, despite my own feelings of guilt, I understood. He was struggling too in his own way, but it didn't make things easier. The space between us felt insurmountable now. We were two people who had shared something that neither of us knew how to categorize, and now we were left with the fallout. We couldn't undo what had happened, and we couldn't return to what we had been before. I knew I had to make a choice, but I wasn't sure what it was. I couldn't continue this way, walking around with this unbearable tension between us. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when every interaction with him felt like an exercise in avoidance. But I also couldn't ignore the deep-seated fear that made me hesitate. What would happen if I confronted it? What would happen if I acknowledged that I had feelings for him, that the pull between us wasn't just about his alien nature, but something deeper that I couldn't explain? The thought of confessing what I felt terrified me. But doing nothing was even worse. I was stuck in a limbo, unable to move forward, afraid to move back. The pain of knowing that I had ruined everything with my partner was still fresh, but the complexity of what had happened with the captain was suffocating me. I had no answers, only questions, and they piled up, making it impossible to think clearly. I knew that something had to change. The captain and I could no longer keep pretending that everything was normal. But the fear of what acknowledging the truth would do to both of us, and the fear of what it would mean for my future, held me in place. I didn't know how to move forward, didn't know if I even could. All I knew was that the space station, once a place of routine and comfort, had become a prison, and I was trapped in it.